US President Donald Trump has wrapped up his trip to China, where a focus was firmly on tech trade and tariffs at the centre of the talks between the president and Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Now, it's the first visit by an American president in nearly a decade when Mr Trump was last in office. But this time he brought a delegation of tech leaders, including Tesla chief Elon Musk and Apple CEO Tim Cook. Joining us now to break down the trip is former CIA officer Mike Baker. Mike, always good to see you. OK, let's talk about whether this was a success or not. There was no major deal on trade made. Was most of the success just in the fact this actually happened?
Well, I think in the sense, that it took place. You don't want to underestimate the value of a summit like this, but you also want to be pragmatic. There was a fair amount of buildup leading to this, as if this was going to be a high stakes meeting. The reality is, for most of these summits, these big events like this, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. There's usually very few outcomes that are significant. There's a lot of conversations in the side there that take place off the radar. And so that's important. But typically, you don't get big deals out of something like this.
What about the Middle East and also, very importantly at the moment, Taiwan? What came out of the talks regarding those two really important subjects?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, the first thing that came out of Xi's mouth almost was Taiwan. And some have classified it or characterized it as a warning to President Trump and the U.S. about how the U.S. should be handling Taiwan. But it's interesting, and it shows how for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan, and for Xi Jinping in particular, Taiwan is top of mind. There wasn't really much in the way of discussion, as it turns out, of significance related to the Middle East conflict. I think that perhaps the U.S. delegation went into this thinking that they had the upper hand and could coerce China into working with them to convince Iran to reopen the strait. But that's not really how the Chinese Communist Party works, right? They're not going to allow themselves to get pushed into something like that, because from their perspective, they're enjoying the moment where the U.S. is distracted, is burning through munition stockpiles, is expending resources. And even though they are somewhat dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for energy supplies, they have workarounds. It
was interesting after it was finished, after he returned back, and Trump said that China was open to helping out in the Middle East. And then we saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio then in complete contradiction said we don't need China's help. Is there any danger in that in terms of diplomatically how China would view that?
Well, look, you do tend to get kind of a hallmark of the Trump administration, this one, the previous one. You do try to get mixed messages, right? You'll get very optimistic statement, and then you'll get somebody walking it back. And so I don't think that is necessarily surprising. But the Chinese do spend a great deal of time, the regime spends a great deal of time kind of parsing words and looking and analyzing and studying. So I do think that sort of what could be perceived as the chaotic nature of a Trump administration does keep the Chinese regime on the back foot, and sometimes that's not a bad thing.
Mike, there were reports that some within the US administration actually took burner phones to these talks. Is that true?
Yeah, look, if they didn't travel with burner phones, that would be an incredibly moronic move, right? And it's indicative of something that, personally, I think I would like to have seen the U.S. delegation, I would like to have seen Trump make more of, which is the incredibly aggressive and constant efforts by the Chinese intel apparatus to steal intellectual property, research and development, basically economic espionage, right? Yeah. And so that is just a prudent move on the part of the delegation, and for really any delegation visiting China, to operate with clean electronic devices or burner phones.
Yep, it shows where the trust may end, right? All right, Mike, thank you. We always appreciate your insights.